Okay, here we go. Ready to get started.
Okay, welcome to our transportation seminar this week. My name is Jennifer Dill. I'm a faculty member in Urban Studies and Planning, and along with Rob Bertini and Chris Monsieur, who are unable to be here today. I know Rob in particular is in Montana with a bunch of civil engineering students testing concrete canoes, which is an annual tradition of engineering schools.
Huh.
So anyway, so that's why he's not here. To remind you, those folks who are new, we do webcast the seminar, and so if you're going to ask a question, you need to use the microphone in front of you, hold down the touch button with the red light on so that people watching on the web can hear the question. And those, I think, are all the logistics. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Pat Egan, who is the State Affairs Manager for the Port of Portland. And he's here today specifically to talk about Connect Oregon, a new initiative from the governor.
Well, good afternoon. This is a first for me. He asked me if I was going to be disturbed by watching myself on television, so I guess we'll find out. Thank you for the introduction. My title with the Port of Portland is the State Affairs Manager, which is kind of a long way of saying lobbyist. My primary duty, although I have others with the Port of Portland, is to represent the port before the legislature, before state agencies, some administrative proceedings, and other governments as well. We do have local government affairs folks and federal government affairs folks, but the state is my primary role. Also work with our business developers. We have people that actually do planning along with private developers and public developers on rail, marine infrastructure, other various facets, and obviously aviation, because we manage 4 airports as well. The bulk of my presentation, I'll get to this in my PowerPoint in a minute, is to talk about Connect Oregon, which is a relatively new idea in Oregon, and the crux of Connect Oregon is looking at the possibility of putting public dollars, public investments into all modes of transportation. And I'll talk about this in a minute, but in Oregon, we have a highway fund constraint. The Constitution in Oregon says that all dollars that are generated off of the highway stay on the highway. So whether that's the gas tax, registration fees, title fees, and the weight mile for trucks, all of that goes into the highway fund. And the highway fund, and it has been litigated numerous times. It's a large public policy issue over time, but all of those dollars have to stay in the highway mode. There are other states out there, many of them actually, that don't have the same constraint on their transportation revenues. Those transportation revenues can go across modes. They could go to, I guess, concrete canoes, possibly, but they can go into marine infrastructure, railroad infrastructure, transit infrastructure, aviation. And in Oregon, we don't have that flexibility, the fungibility of the funds. And so the story of the genesis of Connect Oregon, and by the way, I'm not a transportation planner, I'm not a transportation professional. I have been, and I'll tell you a little bit about my history in a minute. I've been a transportation policy advisor in the legislative arena, and then for Governors Kulongoski and Kitzhaber as well. And so my professional understanding of transportation really has been derived out of a political understanding, and I've relied heavily on other professionals to fill out my substantive knowledge of the topic area, but primarily my expertise is in the political arena. And if you have any questions as I'm going forward, please don't hesitate to stop and ask me. But the genesis of Connect Oregon really came out of my work for Governor Kitzhaber, and I was his transportation policy advisor for the last 3 years. The fellow who had that position before me is in the back of the room here, Mr. Greg Wolf, who is actually employed now here at PSU and runs the National Policy Consensus Center, and is a great professional. And I can't remember the exact date, but in May of 2000, there was a ballot measure that had been there was a bill that had been passed in the 1999 legislative session. There had been no new transportation funding for 8 years in Oregon. A lot of activity and not much result. And through Greg's leadership and others, the legislature actually passed out a gas tax increase and a repeal of the weight mile, which is how trucks are taxed in the state of Oregon. And not long after the end of session, AAA and a variety of others referred that ballot measure, or that bill, out to the voters. I think it took them all of about, 2 weeks, Greg, 3 weeks maybe, to get about 100,000 signatures, whatever was necessary to get that referred to the ballot. And so Oregon voters voted on that in May of 2000. And I'm pretty sure, I haven't done the research on all of this, but I think it was the most flaming defeat in Oregon history, ballot measure history. It was an 88-12 in terms of percentages. I looked it up this morning. It was about a little over 100,000 yes votes and a little over 700,000 no votes. So, you know, you can parse out, politically speaking, a 60-40 loss. You can parse out a 70-30 loss. Not too many ways to interpret an 88-12 loss other than, you know, really don't go there again, folks. And now there were a couple of components of that. There was a gas tax and a weight mile repeal, but the crux of the opposition had been, and this was in the context of Oregon's larger anti-tax movement, but had been really, we don't want to pay any more gas taxes. Gas prices are high enough. We don't want to do this again. And so I think anyone that really had the perspective of thinking that something productive could have happened in the 2001 legislative session really should have considered therapy or some sort of professional counseling in some form. And Greg was smart enough to cast off the transportation policy duties to myself. I had not long before that joined Governor Kitzhaber's staff. Before that, I'd worked for the House Democrats for 8 years and then lobbied for a couple of years for a variety of folks, including some transportation interests. So a lot of different perspectives on transportation over time, but I'd never delved into it to the degree that I did when I took over those duties in the governor's office for Governor Kitzhaber. And so in the ashes, I guess, of this 88-12 defeat, and myself being handed the transportation duties, gee, Pat, what are you going to do now? And I'd had a few conversations with Greg and with the governor, then Governor Kitzhaber, about what were our options. Should we take a pass on the revenue discussion and let another 2 years go by, or should we start to think about how we can shift the debate a little bit? And again, most legislative candidates at the time were running on no new gas taxes. We won't go there, and so it was pretty limited in terms of our options. But started pulling together a group with Greg's help and at the governor's direction to start thinking about this highway fund constraint and how roads, rail, and everything else in transportation are funded in the state of Oregon. And Governor Kitzhaber's own personal view was that the highway fund constraint is not a proper constraint. He looked at other states like Wisconsin, Virginia, and some others that do not have this constraint that I've mentioned a couple of times. And his direction to us was to really start to explore what steps could we take to go down that path. Now, as much as I agree with him on the policy of that, the politics of that, I think, are very difficult, let's say. Up until the early 80s, the highway fund had also included state police and state parks. And at some point, I think it was 1984, there was a ballot measure, again, Oregon voters considered to carve out parks and state police and just keep transportation funding to just that, highway funding. And that passed handily. I can't remember the percentages, but it was a high percentage. And since that time, Oregon voters have been asked twice to allow state police back in. And I think the first time that was referred out, it was a 3-1 defeat. The second time it was referred out after the 2001 session, it was a 4-1 defeat. So it was kind of no, 1,000 times no. And different question than taking those dollars and putting them to rail, but certainly sort of the idea that highway fund was something that people saw as fungible across other spending categories was, I guess, reinforced. So we had every couple of weeks for several months a number of discussions about what we should do coming into the 2001 session, and started looking at the different. And this is some of the work that Greg had actually started, but started looking at other revenue options than the gas tax. And started to articulate a message around registration fee and title fees. In Oregon at the time, registration fees, we were dead last. We were 51st when you count Washington, D.C. in terms of what auto drivers at least pay in registration fees on an annual basis. Title fees, I think we were 42nd or something like that. And so devised essentially a low-hanging political fruit strategy to try to put together what we called then the Oregon Transportation Investment Act, which ultimately passed. But the idea was to increase the title fees, leave the registration fees alone for a while, increase the title fees, and put those dollars toward new road investments, and to at least put us back into this revenue discussion and not just take another 2 years and say, 88 to 12 defeat, we hear you. We said, well, we're going to try it. And it was not at all popular for the first 2 or 3 months of session, but we had some success with a couple of the transportation committees who were very aware of the need. And we are still today, and we certainly were then, the lowest funded, Oregon, the lowest funded per capita and per mile state in the nation in terms of transportation funding. And even with the success we've had over the last couple of sessions, that is still the case. Oregon is still very low, and there are a variety of reasons for that, but one of them is that anti-tax environment that I mentioned, and the other is the registration and title fees, which have not been increased for quite a while. So that was what we did. We actually got a $500 million bonding package done. Those registration fees went into a bonding package, and actually it was $400 million at the time. We increased it to $500 million in one of those fund special sessions that we went through, and we're able to get those projects together. I think it was about 122 individual projects around the state. Not many new pieces of construction, really. A lot of it was just revamping and doing some maintenance and preservation that was long overdue all around the state, but that was that package. But still we had this constraint, and as we were watching other states, particularly Washington and California, they were increasing. Not only were they taking better care of their highways in terms of funding those, but they were expanding into these other modes, particularly rail. And for example, in 1992, California voters, the legislature put a question before them to put $1 billion with a B in rail funding over the next 10 years. This was in 1992. That measure was quite successful. It passed, and so over that period of time, while Oregon, we were still just trying to keep up on the highway fund, California was doing that and more. They were funding aggressively rail of all types, commuter rail, heavy freight rail, even light rail out of that, and a variety of investments that we just didn't have the resources to do. Washington State, in the 2003 session, put together a package that included a significant amount of highway funding, but also had marine funding and rail funding. The rail funding was just short of $250 million, I believe. So at the same time, we come into the 2003 session having had a mild success with OTIA 1, that's the Oregon Transportation Investment Act, and we're forced with the same sort of question with a couple of new twists. For the 2003 session, a report had been put together that said Oregon bridges are in a very sad state of disrepair, and a variety of reasons for this. A couple of things just to point out. One, we had, as I understand it, and I wasn't around at the time, but 70 years prior we had a chief bridge engineer at the Oregon Department of Transportation who had his own personal view of, and it's not that personal, but his own professional view, I guess, of how bridges should be designed, how they should be constructed, when the rebar should go in, how the concrete should be poured, which at the time was fine when trucks were running 40, 60,000 pounds. Well, in Oregon, trucks can run up to 105,000 pounds and more. So we had some rapid deterioration, particularly on the coast. A study had been done that came out, I think it was mid-2002, that said we've got not a 1, not a 2, not a 3, but a $4.5 billion bridge problem in the state of Oregon, meaning pretty soon we were going to have some failures, and we actually had one in that period of time down in Roseburg. Some bridge failures, some massive cracks, and some severe, not just safety issues, but also it's a freight issue. You can always redirect traffic, you can have detours, but I-5 and I-84 are really lifelines for the state of Oregon in terms of freight and moving people. And if those shut down, would have a severe impact on Oregon's economy. So that quickly became transportation funding priority one, and in an odd way, and I won't say we were happy about that, because that is bad news. I mean, that's a lot of money, and given the revenue context we had previously enjoyed, it was a difficult task. So we put together what was then called OTIA 3. OTIA 3 was going back to the low-hanging fruit, a little bit higher up on the tree, but registration fees after we had passed OTIA 1, I think we had popped from 51st all the way up to 47th. So there were a couple of states that had lower registration fees than Oregon, and our title fee I want to say we'd gone from about 46th down to 42nd. So we still had that argument that here we have a major problem on the bridges. By the way, we still have a major problem outside of the bridges with maintenance and preservation, and we have really no new modernization, no new major projects happening in the state of Oregon. So how's about we go back there, set the gas tax aside here, and increase registration and title fees again. So we put together a package that placed us, because it passed, at 34th in the nation in title fees, and I want to say we're up now to about 44th, 45th. Actually, it's in my presentation, so I'll get to that in a minute. But that actually, we had 3 no votes in the entire. That was widely regarded. Legislature embraced it in an environment where there still was a lot of anti-tax sentiment overall, but it was seen as an economic development package as much as it was a transportation package, because there are various studies on this, but the conservative studies say between 18 and 20 jobs are created for every $1 million that you spend on a transportation project, just in the construction phase. I'm not talking about once the project is completed. So what we had envisioned and what we got was a $2.5 billion package, which translated to a lot of jobs. Now, you may have seen some recent coverage on whether these figures are accurate or not. I'm not going to stand steadfast on them, other than to say there are a variety of studies out there. Oregon has done a number of them, and those figures have been pretty consistent. The federal government uses a different study that says it's about 40 jobs per $1 million. So we erred on the side of caution and argued those numbers down. So OTIA 3 passes, and we're all patting ourselves on the back, thinking we've done a wonderful thing and creating a number of jobs, and I think we did. But we still had this the fact that congestion was growing, that congestion in all modes was growing, and that Oregon still had not funded these other modes of transportation. Coupled with that, we started seeing more and more literature that said, with the Trans-Pacific trade and with the population growth, freight was going to double somewhere in the period between 2005 and 2025. Some studies say in the next 15 years freight's going to double. Other studies say that in the next 25 years freight's going to double. So let's call it even and say in the next 20 years freight's going to double. Now, today we have a number of trucks on Oregon roads, and I don't see Oregon's highway capacity doubling anytime in the near future, if ever. And a number of these other states, again, that had started to creep into funding other modes of transportation with whatever funds that they had. Some had put lottery dollars to other modes of transportation. Some had put, as I say, gas tax and registration and title fees. So at the time, I was working for Governor Kulingoski, who was governor for OTIA 3. And once we had passed OTIA 3 and gotten all of the news articles done on that, we started thinking about where should we go next, and quickly, and actually with I've got to give some legislators credit on this, who had really become annoyed with our emphasis on highway fund and really not looking at the other modes. And by other modes, I mean transit, aviation, rail, and I'm missing one: transit, aviation, rail, and marine. How could I forget marine? I'm from the Port of Portland. And so we took that to heart and started putting together a package that is what you'll see in a minute, which is Connect Oregon. And again, the idea with Connect Oregon is to try to break down this barrier between public investments and the other transportation modes, and to find a way to invest in those. Back to that highway fund constraint, how to do it? Well, like it or not, Oregon's lottery fund is very robust, let's say, and was at the time likely to grow. Forget the new line games. We'd seen consistent growth. The 2003 legislature had passed a bill to direct the Lottery Commission to go from 5 video poker machines per outlet to 6 video poker machines per outlet. We were pretty confident that you saw in the news article this morning about the video or the lottery vendors' rates coming down. We were pretty confident that that was going to happen. We didn't know how much, but we knew it was going to be more revenue. And so started looking at the constitutional basis of lottery dollars, and the original use of lottery dollars in the Constitution was for, I think verbatim, economic development and job creation. Since then, the lottery has been expanded to fund K through 12. 18% off the top of net revenues of lottery dollars go into K through 12, and 15% off the top of net goes into what are called Measure 66 expenditures, which are parks and habitat restoration, primarily salmon fish restoration. And so overall, had more funding available. And I will add, during the 2003 session, we did have a couple of expenditures in these other modes of transportation. One of them was a $10 million expenditure that had been packaged together for industrial rail spur investments and $2 million for Oregon short lines. And I participated in that at Governor Kulongoski's direction, and again, we thought we were doing a great thing, and at the time, that was the most money that had ever been allocated by a legislature into rail investments. But again, back to Washington State, and this is my own personal envy, $10 million in Oregon, nearly $250 million in Washington, and I'm looking at my friends at the north and saying, how are you doing this? And I'll get to that in a minute, but that started driving us. We also had the channel deepening project, which got, again, I think for the third session in a row, $27 million, and finally those dollars have been allocated to the channel deepening project, the additional 3 feet in the Columbia River for marine freight. So that gets us to the introduction of Connect Oregon. Before I jump into the PowerPoint, does anybody have any questions about what I've said so far? Okay. Well, the Connect Oregon, which is really just a kind of a way that we've marketed this. This is captured in Senate Bill 71, which just this week passed its first hurdle, which was the Senate Transportation Committee, unanimously, I must add, which was not easy. But we got that done. And the introduction, and this is sort of the background I've shared with you a little bit, is that translating now directly into the legislative arena, the bulk of the political action had been on the highway fund, and that makes sense. They had been focused on the highway fund. They've been fighting over it for a number of years, and so one of the challenges we had to do was to attract some attention and basically some just basic understanding into these other modes of transportation. I mentioned the recent successes that we've had with the OTIA 1, 2, and 3 packages, which had really heightened the awareness among political leaders across the political spectrum. Transportation doesn't tend to break down on partisan lines, which I'm pleased to say, because it makes my job a little bit easier. But after we had passed this transportation package in the 2003 session, I saw Republicans and Democrats, candidates and incumbents, putting this vote and this package in their literature. So the good news on that was they had seen the value of investing in transportation. Bad news is it was back again mostly on the highway fund side. We have also seen, despite what you've seen in the Oregonian, we have seen positive short-term economic impacts. A lot more folks employed. That translates into both corporate income tax and personal income tax. So that has been a benefit. But as I've mentioned here, there really in Oregon had been no sustained funding or attention to these other modes of transportation. Now I mentioned other states here, and I've got in one of the handouts that I gave you an allusion to some other states, the bullets on this page that I'm mentioning here. That in Washington State, nearly $250 million in rail in 2003. As I mentioned, California, $2 billion toward rail grants in 1993. Florida, on a regular basis, puts $10 million into marine port development grants. Georgia has regularly dedicated money to their marine ports, and a number of other states have routinized marine port investment programs and routinized rail infrastructure investment programs. Now, the revenue picture in Oregon, as I mentioned, see if I've checked myself here. We've gone from in the late 80s, early 90s being first in gas tax by attrition, basically not raising the gas tax since 1991, where it went up a whopping 1 penny, from first down to 12th. And actually, I think we may even be lower with some legislative activity already this year. Title fees, 34th, and registration fees, moved from 51st to 46th, so really climbing up that scale there. But with all of that, as I mentioned, we have the lowest taxpayer investment per mile and per capita on the West Coast, and still one of the lowest in the nation. Now, the OTIA packages that I mentioned, those are not in a 2-year time frame. That's over a 10-year time frame. So sustained bonding activity and sustained capital construction activity over a 10-year period. I mentioned the investments in other modes in 2003. Note 0 in aviation, $25 million in commuter rail. This is a reapproval of something that the 2001 legislature had done. You may be aware that there's a link between Wilsonville and Beaverton that's being considered for a commuter rail link, and has been hot and cold on the federal level. I think it's relatively cold right now, but they're trying to warm it up. But the state had put $25 million up for when that project matures. This is my halfway facetious slide. One of the challenges that I ran into, and I guess it's my own appeal, I don't know what your interests are, but there really is no good research. There's some, I will say, but when you start talking about, and really, as I mentioned, transportation politics don't break down along partisan lines, but they do break down along modal lines. There are the transit people, there are the truck people, there are the rail people. That's a different breed. And there are marine and aviation people kind of over here. But there has been very little literature that I've seen, some that's been done, and usually with a particular tint to it, not terribly objective. There's usually a message there that objectively tries to compare a public investment that would tend to move freight via truck versus a public investment that would tend to move freight, let's say, by rail. There is some literature out there that compares, different emissions, different diesel consumption rates, different other economic gauges, but very little that I've been able to see, at least, that does a good job of comparing the economic benefits and other benefits of investing in one mode versus another. So I'd be curious if any of you have any thoughts about that later on, I guess. This is a little bit that I'd been able to gather, and I may be able to update this sometime soon. But this slide really looks to state, federal, and local investments across all of the modes. And the most recent year I was able to get data was for 2000. So there again, you may be able to help me out. But you can see, and this makes sense. I'm not making an appeal that these bars should be evened out, and we should have $50 billion in each of the modes, but it gives you a sense for where the public dollars are being put, which is obviously predominantly in the highway mode. Transit is federal transit authority dollars go into light rail and bus systems throughout the nation, and local dollars generated as well. Airways and airports, those are everything from like Portland International Airport down to mom and pop type of an airstrip that a county may operate someplace in Florida. Railroads, you can see, are dead last, and up till recently, they've actually liked that. And I can talk about that a little bit, but basically the posture, politically speaking, of most railroads has been, you take care of your business, we'll take care of ours. We don't want government tie-ups, we don't want government money, because necessarily government money means you're going to watch us do our business, and we're fine, thank you very much. That has changed, I think, fairly radically and fairly quickly over the last couple of years, but you see here that and combining state and federal money primarily, not much investment in the railroad mode. Rivers and harbors, primarily that's dredging money. There's very little federal or state money, although I have mentioned a couple of states that programmatically put money onto the land side improvements, dock improvements, cranes, those kinds of things. Most of this money is federal money for dredging, maintenance, and deepening. So, obviously, statements here, but the policy goals of Connect Oregon are to expand transportation funding across all modes and to maximize public and private resources. One of the things that's a selling point for me in Salem as I'm talking about this Connect Oregon package is the idea that we're able to, hopefully, if we have state money, like Washington State, for example, has done, go to the federal government and say, well, we have our own piece of this particular project. Let's say it's $100 million rail and truck improvement of some kind. If we're going to the federal government saying, we need all $100 million, they can say, well, get in line. And if we're up against Washington State for an earmark, for example, which has money for this, we'll be further back in the line. If we have money to leverage either private or public resources. Something like Connect Oregon puts us in a position to leverage those dollars and first of all, have a better chance politically speaking and economically speaking of getting them, but stretching the dollars further. Mention here the Transportation Equity Act, which is the federal reauthorization, which is, I think, 2 years behind now. There's a lot more optimism, I guess, that this Congress will be able to pass the new federal authorization. We'll see whether that's realized. I tend to be an optimist, but with Congress it's a different story. But we'll see. And this last point, really, I've said this a lot to my colleagues down in Salem, even if we don't ultimately get Connect Oregon, part of my goal and mission, it's not just mine, there are a lot of other people certainly involved in Connect Oregon, is that if we can just get legislators to wake up to the fact that other states are, as I put it, lapping us. They're kicking our tail in terms of funding these other modes of transportation. At least having that understanding and the value of not just on the competitive level, the value of putting these dollars in other modes of transportation, that in itself will be a win. Even if we don't get the dollars, just getting that understanding and that level of attention will be a win. And I'd say to some degree we've already achieved that. The initial process was, and this was again started before I left the governor's office. I went from the governor's office to the Port of Portland in January of 2004. Yes. So before I left the governor's office, I'd worked with ODOT on this, and since then I've continued to work with them and a variety of others. And again, certainly not just me. There are a variety of folks that have contributed, legislators, stakeholders in the department, to the effort. But was to build foundation through the Department of Transportation, go out to stakeholder groups, the Oregon Ports Group, shippers, and others who have some influence in the legislative process and would have a stake in this to get them to understand what was coming. To get the bill introduced, which we did. Again, it's Senate Bill 71. You can look it up on the legislative website. It's very short, although it's now been amended. But to get that done, which we did, to build project inventories in each of the modes. One of the things that came up as we were putting together this grand little scheme was the fact that there hadn't been any project inventories in a comprehensive way in the other modes. Aviation's sort of a separate thing because the FAA requires all airports to have a master plan of what their capital needs will be in the coming years. But taking marine, for example, in Oregon there are 23 ports. They're everything from, like the Port of Portland, we're a creature of statute, but we're kind of a quasi-special district. We cover our territory, so to speak, is Washington, Clackamas, and Multnomah counties, but even that doesn't quite work. Marion County is our #1 exporting county, so we serve across the state. There are smaller ports on the coast that have no marine commerce whatsoever. It is just, not just, I don't mean to demean it at all, but commercial fishery, for example, recreational boating, those kinds of things. So you have a hodgepodge of all kinds of different ports, and sometimes they get along and sometimes they don't. But no one had ever gone to them and said in a comprehensive way, okay, we want 23 of you to tell us what your capital needs are for the next 10 years because the state has an interest in your development or not. And so that was part of the process that we had to go through, was to go to each of these modes. And first of all, if there had been literature, and rail is a good example, there have been some good studies done out there of the rail needs across the state. But to try to compile that all in one place so that when legislators ask us, as they have, okay, you want this money, what are you going to spend it on? We have an answer. And it's still a work in progress, but we've made a lot of progress on that so far. As I mentioned, creating an awareness and advocacy through stakeholder groups, which has been a treat. Building the process necessary to execute the projects. Again, we have the equivalent in the marine side of a half of an employee in all of state government that really spends time on marine stuff. So, if we want to spend $30 million, let's say, on marine projects across the state, who's going to execute that? Is it the Department of Transportation? Is it the Economic Development Department? Is it the Marine Board? Who's it going to be? So that was an element that we had to go through, and again, work in progress. But I think we've got that fairly well solidified. Get committee hearings, which we now have had, and then move the bill to Ways and Means. Current status, as I mentioned, Senate Transportation Committee had 5 hearings. It was the first bill that they considered back in January. We had 25 witnesses that all testified in favor. No one approached the witness table and said they think this is a bad idea. So we had a lot of buy-in across the state. The Transportation Committee, as I mentioned, Wednesday afternoon with some amendments, which I'll get into in a little bit, referred the bill to Ways and Means, where it will sit, I think, for a while, along with the budget, the rest of the budget. But that's a substantial hurdle, and we made it. A couple of existing issues. One is the overall budget, which the overall budget picture in Oregon is much better this year than it has been for the previous 3 or 4 years. But still, it's not Fat City. There's a lot of contention and debate around all monies, including lottery dollars. So as this is structured now, it's a $100 million package, but you don't spend all that $100 million right now. These are infrastructure projects, so you bond for those dollars. I get in that in a little bit, but so the debt service, the amount of money that's used up in this biennium is more like $3 to $5 million. So that's the debt service for the first biennium here, and then beyond in future biennia, it will be more like $18 to $20 million to pay off that debt. We did get into committee into an issue of loans versus grants, and this gets into some other politics that I won't take your time up with. But should we, if we're going to create this fund, should we go to a short line rail company, for example, and say, well, we'll either give you a grant, and there's a matching requirement, or we'll offer you a loan. And there was some debate about that, and right now the bill says of the $100 million, $60 million would go out in grant, $40 million will go out in loan. I think Ways and Means will probably change that, but we'll see. But that's one of the debates that's going on out there. Still, there's public investment in all modes. Rail has some people that love it, and rail has some people that hate it. But what is true about rail is most of rail in Oregon is private. And so the basic debate is, should Oregon, or any public entity, federal government or others, take public money, lottery dollars or other, and put it into a private owner? Union Pacific Railroad, Portland and Western Railroad, is that a proper thing to do? My own flip answer to that is I almost don't care, because other states are doing it, and they've reached that conclusion from a public policy standpoint. The more in-depth answer is, I think, back to that freight doubling in the next 20 years, I think we have an obligation to make sure that rail, which can handle a lot of freight, is in the best shape possible. Another piece of the debate here is, should we be earmarking projects? So of that $100 million, should legislators from area X, county Y, get their little project, or should we create a fund, turn it over to the Oregon Transportation Commission, which is a step removed from the legislature, and make it a very competitive process where every applicant for these funds has to say, this is how it's going to improve the transportation network, this is what jobs will be created, this is the return on the investment, these are the dollars that we're putting on the table as matching fund. And if I didn't make it clear, I definitely lean more toward the investment fund approach as opposed to earmarks. Now, earmarks has its own brand of politics, which we got into a lot in the 90s, and I think that politically speaking and from a public policy standpoint, I just think that that's not the way to go. And then finally, limitations on eligibility. Should very large companies, very large rail companies, for example, have access to grant funds? And again, I have the same flip answer. I'm not sure I care. Washington and California, who are our competitors in many ways, particularly in the port world, have reached that conclusion. I've already mentioned many of the concept elements here, primarily funded through lottery bond proceeds, $100 million for the 05-07 biennium, which starts in July of this year and then goes to June 30th of 2007. So to get those dollars out on the street, a lot of process needs to go into place. Need to have the application process. You need to actually write the forms. You need to go out and seek applicants or talk with applicants about the requirements, but that needs to be done. The original version of the bill, what we did with the $100 million was to put 10% of the $100 million into each of the 4 modes. So $10 million to rail, $10 million to marine, $10 million to transit, and $10 million to aviation. The idea there was that because we have not programmatically invested in these funds over a long period of time, we have a backlog of good needs, good projects for each of the modes. And rather than set up a transit project up against a very worthy rail project, that we'd at least have a minimum percent for that. That ran into some trouble in the committee, and that was deleted. So, and by the way, before I get off of it, that left $60 million for projects across any of the modes, so highly competitive among the in the 60 million. The committee took that out for a variety of reasons, which I can get into a little bit. I don't want to speculate too much, but I think they really wanted to see it be a highly competitive process across the board, which I tend to agree with, but I still thought it was a cool little idea. The other piece of this is to try to maximize leverage, so to have a 20% minimum match. Let's say you have a $10 million improvement you want to do. The applicant has to be able to say that they've got $2 million in resource in whatever form. That could be the value of the land. It could be other funds that they've got from whatever. It could be private money. It could be public money. But I'd say in addition to this, that's a floor, not a ceiling. So if I come to the table with a $10 million project and I already have $7 million and I'm asking for $3 million, I think the Transportation Commission, and the bill says that the Transportation Commission should take that into account. And then lastly, there's priority for projects that touch one or more of the modes. So if you have, let's say, a rail improvement, and one of the modes in this case actually could be highway. So if you have a transload facility moving goods from rail to truck or truck to rail, that touches two modes. If it happens to be close to a marine facility, there are three modes. So that won't be a perfect consideration in terms of the substantive logic, but you get the idea. I've mentioned some of the benefits here. Multiple mode investments allow us to compete for other funds and more options, more duplication in the system, or diversity in the system to move people and goods. I've mentioned freight doubling in 20 years. We also have population projections in Oregon that population will double in the next 20 years. So it attempts to address that as well. Oregon, this is one thing that particularly is true at the port and in the Portland area. We have huge existing transportation advantages across all modes. We have two transcontinental railroads that serve Portland. That's actually somewhat unique. They both also serve great marine infrastructure. That's somewhat unique. And we have I-5 and I-84. So we have, from a freight perspective and from a people perspective, we have great existing transportation across all modes. This seeks to continue those investments over time. And again, this is more than my own personal opinion, but highly appropriate use of lottery funds. This is economic development and job creation. Some of the arguments that were true for the Transportation Investment Acts are also still true. We still have low bond rates. We still have an available workforce. This still would be an economic stimulus, and many other states are making these investments. Now, the next few slides just go into some of the work that I'm in each of the four modes that exists. Rail investments, first of all. There had been some literature and some studies that had been done pointing out some of the needs. We've created over the last year something called the Oregon Rail Users League. There had never been sort of a collective umbrella organization that brought together all the rail users in the state. So in my experience in the governor's office and my experience in the legislature, I'd have different rail people coming to me, and they have their own factions. It's Eastern Europe with the rail guys. I'd have Amtrak come to me, and they'd say bad things about freight rail guys. Hey, Gal. I just noticed that was you. The short line people would come in, and they'd say bad things about the long haul guys. The shippers would say bad things about everybody, and no one got along. And so one of the things that we decided was that the rail piece of Connect Oregon was going to be very weak if we didn't have some sort of a constituency group put together. So that's what we did with the Oregon Rail Users League, and we're now a 501, well, not quite yet, but we will be a 501c6. And so that entity, along with ODOT Rail, has tried to put together something of an inventory of rail projects, and I think that's moving along nicely. Primary targets, I think, here will be short line rail infrastructure. Won't get into the terminology much, but they are, in fact, shorter railroads out there. They tend to have been cast off by the long haul guys, Union Pacific or Burlington Northern over time, so their infrastructure is badly in need of updating for heavier cars, faster times. But there's also this thing called the Portland Triangle, which basically reaches out to the Sandy River and out to the Willamette River, and in between there's a lot of good rail infrastructure in the Portland area, but it is highly congested. And so one of the things we think we need to get to, and maybe not with Connect Oregon, maybe as a separate package down the road, is to do some improvements so that rail can move more rapidly through this Portland Triangle, which is the convergence of Union Pacific and Burlington Northern. Obviously, I think this would benefit all rail classes, shippers, and Amtrak, I would say, as well. They're in support of this. The politics around rail have really focused on the passenger side for a long time, but I think there's been a shift now to have more of a focus on freight rail as well. The existing studies out there, and you can do a search if you're at all interested. I think particularly this I-5 rail capacity study is a very good one. That's on ODOT's website. There was a rail plan done, an attempt to have a comprehensive look at rail in 2001, and there have also been a variety of passenger rail studies out there. Just to touch on a future opportunities I see out there, there's this project called the Columbia River Crossing, which is a new I-5 passenger or I-5 bridge, and there's also a rail bridge that goes right next to the existing I-5 bridge. That needs some improvement, and I think potentially there's an opportunity there to tie the two together. And I think that there will be a need for additional rail access on the industrial side in the very near future. Marine investments, as I mentioned, a little bit more arcane, smaller universe of folks that care directly about this, I guess I would say. I'll just note right off the bat for us, at the Port of Portland, Terminal 6 is an international container facility. It's the only one in Oregon. We see Connect Oregon as a potential way to fund some of those improvements out at Terminal 6 that we think we'll need over time. But there are obviously a lot of other ports in the state that would be equally as deserving in getting in infrastructure improvements, upriver ports, coastal ports, downriver ports as well. Aviation investments, again, kind of a different story. Portland International Airport, I think, for example, would not be a potential applicant for Connect Oregon. We're a closed financial loop. Pretty much everything that's improved out there is paid for by you, the passenger, or the cargo shippers, and the federal government through similar funding mechanisms. So I don't see PDX as a potential Connect Oregon applicant. More along the lines of smaller airports around the state that need terminal improvements, runway improvements, cargo access improvements, those kinds of things. I don't have transit. I guess I dropped out my transit slide. Transit's kind of a different story as well. Obviously TriMet up here would be a potential applicant. Lane Transit District, for example, has a high-speed bus network that they're attempting to move forward with. That would have some associated infrastructure improvements that I think would be good applicants for Connect Oregon funds as well, and they've done a very good job advocating for Connect Oregon, I must say. This is a slide just to give you a sense, that doubling figure that I gave you, about how we see, and this is without major changes, major shifts, this is kind of a trend analysis of looking how the different modes, major freight modes at least, will be increasing over time. Again, you see truck is the predominant mode, and I don't see that changing. As much as there may be rail advocates out there that say, well, all of this stuff should go on rail, you're not going to have a rail spur into the back of the Best Buy or the back of the Fred Meyer. You're still going to have a lot of truck movement in any case, and I think that's true both long and short haul. But that said, I think there is an opportunity to shift potentially some of the volume totally from truck to rail. You see rail increasing as well, and actually these probably need to be updated. Freight rail particularly has grown rapidly over the last couple of years, and that's gotten a lot of media coverage lately. Barge, not likely to grow at a huge clip, but still 50% growth over the next 20 years. This is a slide that just kind of gives you a different perspective on rail truck share over the next the same time period, next 20 years. The light shaded blue, green, and gray there is the growth over the next 20 years. The dark shaded is what exists today, but it gives you just a kind of a sense for how rail and truck growth is going to occur, we think, over the next 20 years or so. Wrong way. And this slide also just kind of gives you a sense for that set of assets that I was talking about. We have Union Pacific, which stops just right next to our property, which is a great link out to Chicago, probably one of the best links on the West Coast, up and down the West Coast, because you don't have major mountain passes to go through, at least on the western mountain passes. And you also have Burlington Northern, BNFS, that needs to be changed, BNSF, up to Washington State right there, and I-84 and I-5. So a lot of convergence, and right in there is the marine infrastructure as well, the major terminals that we have, T6, T5, and T4, that moves a lot of freight on the river. So what challenges do we have left and existing, I guess, with Connect Oregon? Competing demands on resources. This is the overall budget picture, but it's also true within transportation. On the federal level, for example, has not been much rail funding, and there's a lot of talk, and I think some slight shift, but still most of the federal money has gone on the highway side. I've underlined building a foundation of understanding among legislators and stakeholders. This is something I run into absolutely every day, and these are not. It's not that they're not paying attention or that they're challenged in some way. It's just transportation is somewhat arcane, and there are a number of legislators. I bet if you polled them, I'd be lucky to get 50% of them that understand the highway fund constraint, for example. There are a lot of people who say, well, let's just take that gas tax money and let's just put it over to rail. And, well, you can't do that. I mean, as much as you may like to, you can't do that. So one of our major challenges is just getting to a basic understanding of what the needs are and what the challenges are. This is a new proposal, and so it merits a lot of explaining to get to yes. And so far, we've been in good shape on that, but it's going to take a lot of work. Once we get this, assuming that we get this, we have to make sure that the department is given the resources necessary, and the private partners are given the resources necessary to make sure that it's successful. We don't want to have a $100 million package with a whole lot of fanfare that just, once you get into the 2007 session, the money's not been spent. We want to make sure that those projects are delivered and they're delivered in a timely way. So that's one of the challenges I think that's out there on the horizon as well. And then I'd just note traditional transportation stakeholder participation. I think there has been a shift in awareness among truckers, among AAA, and some of the others of the value to them of investing in other modes. And traditionally this has not been the case, but I think there's been a little bit of a dawning and more of a breakdown, I guess, between the modes, politically speaking, and an understanding that we can't have all of this stuff go on highways, freight or people, over time. We need to have a little more diversity in the system, and that the highway users will benefit from that long term. And the last that I've underlined here is the great session unknowns. This is sort of the catch-all excuse that I make to my bosses when I'm done is, it's the legislature. Who knows what's going to happen? I mean, the co-chair of Ways and Means, who was a big fan of Connect Oregon, 2 weeks into session, he's gone, And so we've got a whole new group of folks to talk to about it. The budget, thankfully, has largely gotten better, but there are other political undercurrents and cross-currents that we have to deal with and negotiate as we go forward on that. So that's sort of the catch-all excuse there. And so the summary here is that really this challenges the existing transportation funding dynamic in Oregon. I can't overstate that. I think it really is a shift for a lot of folks that I think they're warming up to, but it's taken some time to get the necessary attention on this, I think. To also identify the projects that maximize the resources and have an economic benefit. There are a lot of what I'll call, not in too disparaging a way, I guess, dog projects that will pop up if we get this. Projects that somebody thinks they've got a really great something that needs to happen, and I'm not going to name a county, but County X out there, and gee, if we just did that, we'd get 5,000 jobs. Well, doesn't always work out that way, but that will be a challenge that we'll deal with, is how do you ferret out the good and deserving projects from those that may be not as deserving. That's a big challenge out there, I think, that's waiting for us. A lot of this I think we've been successful in so far, but there's more work to be done on getting more partners for funding. My hope for Connect Oregon is that it's not a one-time shot, that we've shifted the focus and it becomes something that is more routinized like other states have done, but that sustaining that over time is going to take a lot of partners and a lot of hard work. And as I mentioned, being ready to implement successfully and working closely with businesses of all type, local governments, federal government, to make sure we're moving rapidly. So that concludes my Connect Oregon presentation, and I guess I'd be happy to take your questions right about at 1 o'clock. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering with the I-5 bridge.
You want to hit your mic?
potential-
Does the mic come on, just in case there? Okay.
And the potential for a rail connection there. Can you talk about some of the negotiations with the state of Washington on that issue?
It's a good question. Negotiations we're kind of at that stage. Right now it's more just kind of, I wouldn't say looking at each other, but I'll go back a little bit. I've got a friend of mine was transportation policy advisor for Governor Locke, and we talked about this quite a bit, that we really should have more regular communication between the states. And there are a couple of forums out there. There's something called the Bi-State Committee, which talks about a variety of issues, housing, land use, and those kinds of things, but most of their topic is transportation. And so that's one place where they talk about transportation investments. Another is something that's just gotten off the ground, and I think it's called the Columbia River Crossing Task Force. I think that's what it is. But it's got representatives of the two governors' offices. It's got representatives of the railroads. It's got representatives of the cities and the counties across both sides, and private businesses as well. So some of the discussion is happening in those kinds of forums. On the staff level, I would say the directors of the two states get along really well, spend a lot of time talking to one another, and they've actually had the two state transportation commissions, Washington State Transportation Commission and Oregon Transportation Commission, have 2 or 3 joint meetings just in the last year to talk about some of these issues. So I think the dialogue is getting a lot better, and I would also say the congressional delegations have spent a lot of time getting along. The Channel Project is a clear example of that, where I got to say Patty Murray is effectively a Washington or an Oregon state senator, because she's the only member from either state that's on appropriations in the Senate. So she's been very helpful, and so there are a lot of good discussions going on out there. I'd say we've still got a ways to go to make it more institutionalized and have really a better sense. A good example is we discovered recently that Washington State is doing is looking at some improvements from the middle of the I-205 Glenn Jackson Bridge northbound. And we just kind of discovered that in a staff-to-staff sort of meeting. Fairly major thing, should be for us. We've got the airport just on the other side, on the Oregon side. And so that kind of perked our attention. But they were pretty far down the road in terms of looking at some improvements there. And so, not pointing any fingers, Oregon's done a lot of the same kind of thing. So good question. I don't know if I answered it very well, but there's a lot more that needs to be done there, but some good dialogue that's been started. Yes?
Do you think there's any potential for high-speed passenger rail connecting Portland to Vancouver, BC, and that relieving congestion for freight on the highways?
Mm-hmm. The short answer is yes, and there's some very good news, particularly on the Washington side. A lot of that money that I talked about in the 2003 session from the state of Washington went toward the main line northbound up into Seattle and up into Vancouver, BC, actually. And actually even buying some passenger rail cars and some additional sidings so that you have less of this conflict between, because passenger rail runs on the freight rail. They run on Union Pacific in Oregon and Burlington Northern in Washington. So they're sort of an occupant in a way. And in order to resolve some of the conflicts there, basically Burlington Northern said, State of Oregon or State of Washington, we want you to invest in some additional sidings and some passages basically to resolve some of the conflicts there. So Washington stepped up and did that, and those improvements benefit both passenger and freight in the state of Washington. Oregon, a little bit further behind and a ways to go, and Connect Oregon, I think, can do some of those. We've also gotten some federal money over the last couple of years that has done some improvements on the freight rail system in Oregon that has benefited passenger rail as well. To get to really high speed, I think you're going to have a dedicated track, and that is a long-term debate and a much more expensive proposition than what's been envisioned currently. Basically, right now we're talking about doing the improvements both to the physical infrastructure of the tracks and ties and the sidings that I mentioned so that those conflicts are resolved. But that is not going to get you to the kinds of European and Japanese speeds that you may have in mind. 100 miles is not in our near future, I would say. But maybe down the road. There's one little thing that I'd add is the Vancouver Olympics, oddly enough, in 2010, Winter Olympics, I think will have some impact on that. It was one of the selling points, I know, in the Washington legislature in 2003 to say we're going to have a better way to manage all of these people up and down the I-5 corridor. So long-term, yes. Short-term, big challenge. Great.
How does the governor's budget deal with passenger rail outside of this package, or does it only deal with it in the context of this package?
Good question. There are, in the governor's budget, there are two ways that it's addressed. One is Connect Oregon and the debt service associated with that, anticipating that some of the improvements might have an impact or a benefit for passenger rail. So that's on the infrastructure side. The operating side, in case you don't know, Amtrak has got some federal funding problems right now. The president's budget zeroed out their operating budget, which I don't mean to laugh. It's just kind of, wow, that's out there. But I think that'll be resolved. I think there will be federal monies there. But those federal dollars in the Amtrak budget really have generally not flowed to Oregon. The northeastern states and the Midwest states get a lot of Amtrak funding. Oregon typically has not, as you know, gotten really much of anything out of the Amtrak budget. And so the Department of Transportation, through its budget, has to fund the operational costs for the Amtrak, most of the Amtrak. I shouldn't say nothing. They do get some federal money, but the bulk of the operational dollars in Amtrak in the state of Oregon are funded with general fund dollars, not highway fund dollars, general fund dollars. So the governor's budget has them at the base level, the existing operating level. It doesn't expand. There are a lot of folks, and I would say the governor himself is a big passenger rail advocate, and he's got a long record to prove it. But he didn't expand in his budget because of the budget constraints an additional train set or two or three. There's a good argument to be made that we're close to critical mass in regular Willamette Valley service, for example, Portland to Eugene, that if you only have 2 or 3 trains a day, it makes it very difficult for people who want to use it on a commuter basis or a regular basis. If you have more trains, then you'll get more people that use it. Right now, there are a lot of people that do use it. I think it's over 700,000 a year that are using Amtrak in Oregon. Trips, not people. But long answer, but it's in there. Yeah.
Will these dollars have the requirement to put some towards pedestrian and bicycle improvements?
Good question. The short answer is no, and not that those don't merit funding. And this brings up another point on transit versus freight, which has come up in Connect Oregon. But pedestrian and bicycle get a certain percentage of existing highway fund dollars, so they are eligible. They are, and I should have said that earlier. There is an eligible use out of highway fund for now not separate trails, but the sidewalks and bike lanes do get monies out of the highway fund. So partly for that reason, they're not part of Connect Oregon. One of the things that's come up in Connect Oregon is and as I mentioned, there are less partisan divisions in transportation than there are modal divisions. And so you have people that love freight, and boy, they want to do more freight. And speaking from the Port of Portland, freight's right up our alley, but we do care about passenger as well. There are people who just, as you know, really want to focus on transit, really want to focus on bikes, really want to focus on trails and that, and they don't tend to get along. Within Connect Oregon, just the transit piece has been controversial. And in my own mind, and I think in the minds of others, there's two ways you can look at Connect Oregon. One is as a freight-only package, primarily just looking at, because most of these other modes tend to focus more in terms of volume and economic figures on freight. Aviation's a little bit different there, but slightly true as well. Transit obviously is passenger. There's no freight component there. The way that I think and most people look at Connect Oregon is as a non-highway fund transportation package, which if it's viewed in that light, transportation definitely fits in there. If it's viewed as a freight-only package, transit doesn't fit in there. So short answer is bikes and ped are not in. potentially would be an eligible use. I think given the criteria that we've put out here, might be difficult for a bike-only or a pet-only project to compete the way the criteria have been set up. Yeah.
You mentioned the significant investments that Washington and California both put into rail.
Mm-hmm.
Are there spillover benefits that Oregon receives from that? Do things get here cheaper? Or?
It cuts both ways, actually. Yes, to some degree, because if Union Pacific, for example, or their headquarters are in Omaha, and if they're looking at the West Coast and they have good infrastructure in California, this is not getting into too much of freight rail, but freight rail tends to move east-west, not north-south. You have the ports on the western part of the United States, and stuff goes to the interior. It doesn't tend to go up and down. But there is a little bit of north-south traffic, and so if they're looking at California, I mean, I'll get to the second part of my answer, actually. If they're looking at the West Coast and they're saying, well, I can leverage my money in California or I can leverage my money in Washington, but those guys in Oregon don't have their act together, my money can't go further. It's that much more challenging for that decision to be made in Omaha or in San Antonio for Burlington Northern to put money into the state of Oregon if we're not helping to some degree. On the passenger side, I would say that's maybe a little bit different. When you have good investments being done in Washington and in Washington and California, it makes it almost embarrassing for Oregon if we don't step up and do some similar improvements. So in that sense, I think it's helped a little bit. I think, though, that primarily what Washington and California have done by stepping up and putting these investments in has really put Oregon at a severe economic disadvantage. And in the distribution and logistics world, which is the world I mostly live in now, they're very high-paying jobs. In the Portland metropolitan area, for example, about 11.5% of all jobs are related to distribution and logistics, and they're good jobs. They're about $10,000 above the average wage for the metropolitan region. If we are doing more investments, we will get more of those jobs. Now, right now, Washington State, particularly on the marine side, has a lot more resources. They are reaping the benefits of putting those resources in by having more container service and more related freight jobs. If we do the same thing, I think with Connect Oregon, we'll be able to get some of those jobs as well. So good question. Yeah.
So is the major goal of Connect Oregon to increase jobs versus making the infrastructure better for transportation? Because it sounds like you're not really so interested in transportation person-wise, but more on freight-wise. I would argue with your question. The way you phrase your question is a binary. It's not. It's not either or. It's both. And I will say that on the transit side, for example, there has been a lot of investment using lottery dollars in an earmarked way over time. The first lottery bonds ever sold in the United States were sold for West Side Light Rail. So Oregon has, over time, consistently supported TriMet particularly, but transit in a way that they haven't on marine, rail, and aviation on a statewide basis. So I think it's a perceptive question, I guess, in terms of the major thrust of Connect Oregon, which right now I think is primarily freight, although transit's in there. But I don't think it's an either-or. I think the primary question for all legislators and public policy makers looking at this is, should we have this wall on transportation funding that limits us from making the best investment, whether it's a transit project, a marine project, or a highway project? And that's what I think Connect Oregon long-term will get to. The economic situation that we're in right now, and frankly what the transportation needs are right now, I think would tend to make this more of a freight package. But over time, I think it'll have both. Yeah.
Is the increase in barge tonnage projected on the dredging of the Columbia? And where do you see the largest increase in barge tonnage coming from? Is that going to be us exporting more to the world, or are we going to get the spillover from Tacoma and Long Beach?
That's basically an existing trend. The barge comes from four places: Pasco, Lewiston, Umatilla, and
and Morrow. That's not entirely true, but that's where most of the barge traffic is on the Columbia River, coming down to us, transloaded on or put onto a larger vessel for export. There is, so that's existing. Most of that's agricultural product, some other scrap kinds of things. Over time, there's a theory that you'll have more containers coming to us, put on barge, and for retail products, those kinds of things, going to upriver ports for major distribution centers for the West Coast. So Seattle market could be served out of Pendleton. Idaho, as it's growing fairly rapidly, could be served out of the same place. But the chart that you're referring to is mostly existing agricultural growth. So, did I answer your question? Okay.
Any additional questions?
Yes.
You mentioned strategic partners for like multimodal funding packages. Who might be some of these strategic partners?
Well, that would be a catch-all. Anybody that's interested in any of these other modes. That the strategic element, I guess, could be people who have dollars available to invest in, or people or entities, local governments, for example, private investors that would have dollars to put up as the match for Connect Oregon, for the Connect Oregon dollars. Could also be on a political level, folks that would tend to advocate for the Connect Oregon package. It's Lane Transit District, for example. I'll mention them again. They've done a great job in helping us explain the benefits of additional funding. The Pendleton grain growers have signed up and they're supporting Connect Oregon. So it's kind of a catch-all term, I guess. I see another one. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And I'll remind, next week we have Professor Martin Wax from UC Berkeley talking about a quiet revolution in transportation finance. So moving on with our finance theme, at least for 2 weeks.
Yeah. Thank you very much.